Near the cross.
Near the cross.
You know what I'm talking about? Going home with me?
Seriously, Andy. Keep things private. All right. Y'all do know we're just playing, right? Right. Okay, good.
Meanwhile,
Meanwhile,
back at the ranch.
we have a presentation to make.
Oh, is that all the announcements?
Yes, it is. Unless you have something else. Okay. Gay, would you come forward, please?
I feel like I'm hiding, but sometimes if I get a mic, I don't turn loose of it, so it's better I not be up here. You know, how many of you have had a great time so far? You know, those great times don't just happen. There's people in the background that kind of make it happen. And we have a couple of token things we want to give out. But if you were on the committee for this SoloCon, would you stand, please? All the committee members. Come on, Richard. So I'd like the directors to sit down, but I want the committee to come up. That's the combination. This is just a little token of appreciation for all your hard work. A small thank you. Sometimes we look at the directors and we look at the speakers, and we had a phenomenal group working to make this happen. And our directors carried the dream and the vision. And so we had quite a few directors. We needed it. When you're doing a reunion, it's like raising a child. It takes a whole village. It takes people with various skills and personalities to pull things together. And we were blessed to have Keith and Rhonda and Randy at the helm. And so I'd like them to come up. We have a little token for them too. I didn't call him. Keith. Rondella.
He must be really special.
Randy has kids. I promise there's one for you. And just a thank you because they're the ones that pulled it together. And we had some former directors come in with Jerry. There's Randy's right there. And Neil's. Jerry. And Debbie.
Debbie.
And Cindy. Thank you so much for all your work you've done in SoloCon, even if it wasn't in this one. And the one person that really has driven SoloCon for such a long time, Linda. And Donnie Roberts. Donnie was our And what can I say about our speakers?
Oh, wow.
There's not enough words, are there? No. When God put this together, and we were the instruments. But I think if you talk to all of us, we'll tell you this was God doing it. We just had to say yes and amen. And a friend of mine says, what's the greatest thing that you can do for God? And the answer is the next thing He asked you to do. And when God asked our directors and Linda to do this, they said yes. And when they made that phone call to Tim and Mike, they said yes. And they have come and they have blessed our services. There's been an anointing because this is God ordained this weekend. And so we have a small token for you as well, Tim and Mike. What's in the bags are little symbolic things. The notebooks I asked you to write in. There's a Coke in here because they're the real thing. There's a paper clip because when they get it all together, someone hold it together for them. And there's a rubber band because they've been stretched to their limits. And it's a reminder that when you stretch to your limits, God will bring you back in your original shape. And there's an inspirational saying. There's also a cross, because anybody that's involved in SoloCon has definitely carried a cross. Mike? And there's tissues, because there have been a lot of tears shed for this. And we thank you for your devotion, for your willingness to say yes. Thank you. And we also got a little bit of something for the praise team. But I also know you're the next generation. Thank you. Thank you.
So one of the things that I have missed in my life is how SoloCon sings. And we are so grateful not to have missed a beat from the song in our soul that I think has found new voice this weekend. And we thank especially Laura, Jake, Austin, Aaron. We want to take a generous love offering for them from SoloCon. They've come down from Nashville for this week. Left ministry responsibilities, and we want to bless them in some small way because you've blessed us so much. Before we receive this love offering, let's Heavenly Father, what a good Father. To meet our needs, to be worthy of our song and our praise, and to supply those gifted people to this weekend so that you can take your rightful place in our lives and in this community. Father, we pray that you would bless this offering, and more than this offering, that you would bless those who are gathered, that we, yes, may truly be a blessing. Multiply, I pray, what has been given this weekend for kingdom investment in ways we can't imagine. We pray through the strong name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
I'm going to call the usher forward. Barry, Jimmy, Jeff, David, Miller is going to help take the middle aisle. If you want to write a check, and Barry, you take that one. Barry, if Jimmy will take this side. If you want to write a check, you make it out to Laura Newmar. Hey, tell me that little traffic.
Give till it hurts. Come on. Not have cash at all. Dig a little deeper, brother. No pressure. No pressure. But you're
You need to stand up and get to your wallet or your purse. Feel free to do that. Let it borrow someone's take close up. That'll get there next year. Mike, thank
Would you stand together? It has been a good Lord's Day, hasn't it?
Oh.
And you know, because every Lord's Day is an Easter day, and we celebrate that He is alive. I'm just going to say it this way. If you know what to respond, when you respond, He is risen.
He is risen indeed.
You know how to respond. Let's do it again. He is risen.
He is risen indeed.
And third time's the charm. He is risen.
He is risen indeed.
And in celebration that there is a hope, there is a tomorrow, there is never a stone that is rolled in front of any tomb, that death is the final word. Hear what the psalmist says about that. Oh, come now. Let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us now come into His presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to Him with songs of praise. Because the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. Oh, come now. Let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. Because He is our God. And we are the people of His pasture, the sheep of His hand. Let us come before the presence of our Maker, who indeed is our Heavenly Father and has bestowed every blessing upon us. Let's sing together.
Whom I the highest King put down. I was lost, but He brought me in. Oh, His love for me. Oh, His love for me. Whom the Son sets free. Oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Relax. Free at last. That's ransom me, His grace was deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, He died for me. sun sets free. Oh, it's free and me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In the Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who said, you are for me, not against me. I am who said, I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who said, you are for me, not against me. I am who said, oh, I am who said. Sets free, oh, it's free and free. I'm a child, yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child, yes, I am. In the Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I believe in the Son. I believe in the risen one. I believe I overcome by the power of his blood. Amen. 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 Because he lives. Amen. Amen. And my soul turns because he promises are sure. I will stand in the rain. I was covered in sin and shame, but I heard mercy call my name. He heard the sound of because he lives. My songs are because he lives. I can face tomorrow because he lives. Everything is gone. I know he lives in my life, but rise up because He lives. I can face tomorrow because He lives. All fear is gone because I know He knows the future, and life is worth the living just because He lives. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you that there is life eternal in you. God, thank you. Thank you for the price that you paid so that we could be in right relationship with you, so that we could know the Father's heart. Lord, we're grateful. And so tonight we say thank you. We take the breath that you have given us and we give it back to you, God, and we say that your name is great. Not ours, but yours. Let's sing this together. You give life. You give life. You are love. You bring light to the darkness. You give hope. You restore every heart that is broken. And great are you, Lord. Sing, you give life. You give life. You are love. You bring light to the darkness. You give hope. You restore every heart that is broken. Thank you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. It's your name in our hearts, so we pour out praise. We pour out praise. It's your name in our hearts, so we pour out praise to you, holy. Great are you, Lord. You give life. You are love. You bring light to the darkness. You give hope. You restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath. It's your blood in our hearts. So we pour out praise. We pour out praise. It's your blood in our hearts. So we pour out praise to you, Lord. It's your breath in our hearts. So we pour out praise. We pour out praise. It's your breath in our hearts. So we pour out praise to you, Lord. We praise you, Lord. And all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. And all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. Pour out our praise, it's your breath in our lungs. So we pour out our praise to you only. So great are you, Lord.
All God's people said, Amen. Amen. Laura, you and I worked together enough at Rebecca Chapel and Grace Church, so I'm not going to shock you what you're ready to do. You know that great, great, great song that we were going to end with? We actually end with that song that we sang as the Amen, Amen stuff. That's what you call a non-music person. And because for some of us that might be a little new, see, Laura's not even looking strange at me because we've worked together before. She knows I just kind of all of a sudden, could we, after the scripture reading, kind of rehearse just at least that refrain part of it? Would that be okay? Awesome. Awesome. Just a minute, we're going to read scripture together. And if you're able to remain standing, feel free to do that for the reading of scripture. If not, the Lord should understand. I just want to take a real brief moment just to thank you for the incredible personal joy to spend this weekend with you. Many dear friends in this room, and now many new friends. And there is no place that I would rather have been this weekend than right here with you. Thank you for your love, for your hospitality. Honestly, SoloCon South, even years ago, I can't believe it was 20 years ago on those programs that I was here. What's happened to life? And all God's people said, now you don't have to say that. But you have always been, while some live life in this posture, you have always been people who live life in this posture. And this is the posture of God. Thank you for not only doing it for everyone else, but thank you for always having your arms wide open, including this weekend. To a guy coming down here from Nashville. And I just thank you to all who put this together. I know we've gone through all the names, but it's just been an absolute joy. I want us, since there is a little bit of music playing, I want us to try one more time to make sure we know the movements of the dance before we hear scripture, okay? And then we're going to turn to Exodus chapter 3 for the reading of Scripture. I'm going to ask you just to do the motions, okay? No, these aren't motions. This is dance. First of all, can you hear the music?
Yes.
And I don't mean just those incredible people. I mean, can you hear the music? Your life is more than the tips you make. Your life is more than the tips that will not go into the casket with you. Your life is you are the child that God has lavishly bestowed His grace, His mercy, His love, His forgiveness upon, and you didn't wait a single table to get a tip. It's all grace. So, you take just a moment, if you're comfortable with it. If you're not, I know you're doing it in your heart and mind. Just receive grace. It's gift. And now, just let it soak you to the very core of who you are. Embrace it. Let it soak you in. Let it fill your mind, fill your body. But as we've said, and as we share for a few moments tonight, grace that stays in this posture becomes very stale, and it begins to have a terrible stench. In fact, probably the reason a few in our society don't trust the church anymore is because sometimes grace has been kept so tight to ourselves that it really starts to stink. But grace, when it is truly grace, are you ready to do the third movement of the dance? It is released. It becomes the very position that God takes when He opens His life both to prodigals and to those older brothers that have to go outside Himself and be invited back in. And when our arms are in the posture of graciousness, let's do the moves one more time. We receive grace. With gratitude, we embrace it. And with hearts that are free, we release it. Oh, to hear the music. And even this coming week when you're waiting tables, to hear the music. If I were a betting man, I would say, you'll even wait the tables differently when life has the music of God in the background. For a few moments this evening, I want to invite us to a text that we're going to talk just a bit more about that release. I want you to join me, if you would, at Exodus chapter 3. We'll be reading verses 1 through 12. I invite you now to hear the word of the Lord, and then we'll do just a little bit of choir rehearsal, just to make sure when we come to the end of our time together, we are familiar with that incredible song that we sang earlier. Hear now the word of the Lord. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness, literally on the other side of the wilderness. And he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. By the way, Horeb is what the northern people called, what the southern people call Sinai. When I visited Chattanooga, it's so intriguing that if you live on one side of the mountain, you call it one name, and if you live on the other side, you call it another name. That's what happened over that time. These are not two different mountains. Horeb is the northern name for the southerners named Sinai. And so he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. Moses looked, and the bush was blazing, and yet it was not being consumed. Literally, the word is, it was not being devoured. It just kept burning and kept burning. And then Moses said, I've got to turn aside, and I've got to look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burning up. Now when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. And then God said, don't come any closer. Take off the sandals from your feet, because the place on which you're standing is holy ground. And then he said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And then the Lord said, indeed, I have seen the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their taskmasters. Oh, truly, I intimately know their sufferings. And I am coming down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and a spacious land, to a land that flows with milk and honey, to the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. But now the cry of the Israelites has come to me. I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So, go. I send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I'll be with you. And this will be the sign for you. By the way, for those of us who are waiting for God to give us a sign, I love the way this story ends. Let me read it, and I'll make this a brief comment. And this will be the sign for you that it's I who's actually sending you. When you brought the people out of Egypt, you're going to worship God on this mountain. Sometimes, I won't say most often, the sign you've been waiting for from God will come once you dare to put one foot in front of the other and act in it. When you get back to this mountain, that'll be the sign that I called you. Oh, my friends, this isn't just a great story. This is the word of the Lord. Aren't you thankful tonight? Amen. Let's have a little bit of choir rehearsal, and then we'll be seated.
All right, we're going to sing the chorus together. Amen. Amen. Alive, because He lives. Amen. Amen. Let us all join the one that never ends. One more time. Amen. Amen. I'm alive because He lives. Amen. Amen. Let my song join the one that never ends. Because He lives.
And now, Father, in these moments, may the words of my mouth and the thoughts of all of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in your sight. Teach us, O God, how to dance, and open our ears so we hear your rhythm and can find our dance according to your rhythm. We pray this prayer in the name of our risen Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And everybody said, amen. Amen. You may be seated. Lord, thank you. Thanks for praying. I grew up PK. For those of you that don't know what those abbreviations mean, I am a preacher's kid. Once a preacher's kid, always a preacher's kid. Yes, and all the odd preacher's kids applaud. I'll never forget back when I was just a little, first 7 years of my life, and I think this particular night that I really remember, I was probably about 4 or 5 years old, but it was a church that my dad, I don't know if it was the church or if it was just my dad's personality, but he would always be the last one there. And he wasn't there last just because he had to be. He was just kind of one of those people. I mean, he just kind of stayed around to the very end, which meant he was the one that ended up turning out the final lights and locking the doors and all those kind of things. Usually the way it would work is my mom and my younger brother, they would go on home. I'd stay because I wanted to be the last kid to leave because it was the most awesome church parking lot that we could play freeze tag in. And I mean, I burned off more calories then. I wish I could still play freeze tag now. It was amazing, but there was only one problem. You see, I'm still trying to figure out exactly how this church was constructed, but the pastor's study was up here off the front of the sanctuary. And there was like one parking space right there at the pastor's study, and so that's where he would park. Then the rest of the parking lot was all back there. And back there was the parking lot where we would play freeze tag. I will never forget the night. This actually happened a few times. But I will never forget the night that I came in from the parking lot after playing freeze tag. My dad was locking everything up here. I knew the moment was coming. I got to fill in on it. To this very day, I'm sorry. Maybe this isn't holy. But the scariest place on the face of the earth to me is a dark church sanctuary. Oh, do I have an amen? What is it about dark church sanctuaries? I mean, as a little bitty kid, I had this idea of the dark church sanctuary. Actually, I don't know where it came from, but I got this image that when the lights went out, which it's amazing, when the lights are on, everybody's there. I mean, it's the happiest, most wonderful place. You turn the lights out, get rid of the people. Here's what, in my 3-year-old imagination, began to develop. And by the time this happened when I was 4 or 5, I mean, it had taken my imagination over. I believed that when the lights went out, there were these little green, I could draw you a picture. They had one eye. These green, slimy monsters that lived underneath the pews. And when the lights went out, I'm not kidding, because to me, and some of you are going to think, whoa, dude, I'm glad I wasn't in this church back in those decades. I thought the most horrendous thing you could do is what they did in the church sanctuary. I thought they came out of the pews, and all night in the sanctuary, they began to dance. Okay, to me that was like, oh. I will never forget the night I was back there. My dad was up here. I knew it was time to go. I remember as I stood back there, he said, okay, Timmy, let's go. I remember, Randy, right there where you're sitting, I was at that point. The problem back then, over the decades, sanctuaries became shorter but wider with circles. In the old days, I mean, it was narrow and there were so many rows of pews, it just took forever to get up there to the front. I don't see why anybody went to the altar back then. I remember I stood back right in the middle of that center aisle. I thought about it. I knew if I was going to make it from point A to point B, I was going to have to go up the aisle, and there were going to be these green, slimy monsters with one eye that would begin to jump out at me. And in my 5-year-old imagination, I could just imagine myself fighting them off and throwing them all over the sanctuary. And by the time I had thought through all that, I heard him a second time, Tim! Now, there was a progression. Timmy was endearment. Tim was don't let me go any further. There was one more name, and I knew when that name came, he meant business. At Tim, I knew I better start preparing. So I don't know why I did this, but I got into the running position. And honest to goodness, at that point, I was always told, now as a preacher's kid, be a model for all the lay people's kids. Tim, don't ever run in the church. I thought, there's not a layman here. All there are green slimy monsters. I'm not going to offend anybody. And so I got in my running position. All of a sudden, I think I went into AFib. Or at least I started having palpitations. I started breathing hard. I knew if I was going to get from point A to point B, it was that long, dark aisle down the sanctuary that I was going to have to go. I closed my eyes. Why I closed my eyes, I have no idea. It was already dark. I closed my eyes, and I began the 3 count. 1, 1.5, 2, and then it came. Timothy, we're leaving now. He helped me lose count. And so I started all over again. 1, 2. We'll get back to the dark aisle in just a few minutes. Just hang there. Now, some of you have figured out, whether it be last night or other times some of us have been together, when I read the Bible, I'm sorry, I hope it's not sacrilegious. My imagination goes absolutely all over the place. I think that's the reason why I love the Bible. Because it just plays with my imagination. My imagination plays with it. Well, I gotta confess, every time I read Exodus chapter 3, I think of that night at Decatur, Illinois West Side, that long, narrow sanctuary, when the lights were out, and I was doing the 3 count, and the green monsters were ready to get me. You say, how in the world does that imagination with the Bible relate to that? Because in this story, I can hear God saying just like my dad did to me, come on, Moses, let's go. And all of a sudden, we'll get to this in a few moments. Moses went into AFib. Moses started hyperventilating. The questions began to abound. But before we ever get to those questions, before we ever get to God saying, come on, Moses, let's go, I want to remind us what the context of Moses was. It's a context that I believe with all my heart tonight is not that far different at all. In fact, it may be almost identical to the world in which you and I find ourselves. You see, the reason Moses was out there in the wilderness to begin with, remember the story? He had seen now his entire lifetime. He had seen the people with whom he shared life, building pyramids for pharaohs that they didn't even know. He saw them building temples for gods they didn't even worship. Moses knew what it meant for people that he lived life with to have chains on their hands and chains on their minds. And while they worked behind prison doors, he knew exactly what it meant for Pharaoh and the Egyptians to have turned the people that he spent life with into a commodity. Somebody use that word tonight. Let me just explain what I meant. Human beings were treated as nothing more than something that could be given and taken in exchange for something better for Pharaoh and his people. And human beings had become nothing more than commodities to be exchanged. Human beings had become objects. They were labels. They could either build a pyramid, and usually we think probably the life of most of those slaves was about 3 or 4 weeks, and within 3 or 4 weeks, their life ended. They were simply tossed into the trash heap of human beings because there were a whole lot of other human beings who could do the work for Pharaoh and his people. Moses knew so much the world that he was living in. Think about it. He heard the cries of people. He saw the agony of people. He knew the imprisonment of people. Finally, he got to a point in his life, he said, I've had it. And you know the story, the great hero of the Old Testament becomes a murderer. He kills one of the Egyptians who's mistreating one of the Hebrew slaves. And after he has become so fed up that he actually kills the one who has been mistreating a Hebrew slave, he becomes a fugitive. And where does he find himself? That's where our story is tonight. He finds himself in the wilderness. I want to be as God honest as I can tonight. This may seem like a story that's 3,000 years old of an old Egyptian pharaoh. But I know that I know that I know that I know that I know. I live in Egypt tonight. If you listen close enough, you not only can hear the music of God, you can hear the cries of the people with chains on their hands, with prison bars on their minds. You say, Tim, I don't know what we're talking about. Let me just paint a little picture. Talking about that man tonight who has been convinced by his doctor in a pharmaceutical company that he needs to keep upping the opioids.
Yes.
And his life has become so wrecked in Alabama and in Texas and in Florida and in Tennessee and in Georgia that the best thing that could happen to him is for him to be caught, and then he'll go to prison and experience one more jail. Does he want to be addicted to opioids? God help us. No, he doesn't. But he's been convinced that whether it be the pain of his body or the pain of his mind, that it's the opioids. And we who live down here in the South, let's admit it, we are the opioid capital of the United States. They're in your community. They look clean. They look happy. You probably work beside some of them. Can you hear the cry? We're in Egypt. You know that mama? That mama that would absolutely love to have come to a SoloCon this weekend. But that single mama who's got 3 kids, she spends 8 hours every single day working at Walmart and has 1 hour off and then goes for 8 more hours and works at Logan's just to get my great big 15% tip. And tonight that mama, I'm talking, you know what I'm talking about? People as commodities. People as objects. People that have been born into certain situations. That if they could change it, if they could have even half of your life and my life, if they could have even come to 2 hours of a SoloCon, can you hear the cries? I'm talking about that widow who for 60 years of her life, she taught Sunday school class. She was in the choir. I mean, if the doors of the church were open, she would be the first one there. And when it came time for the church to take communion, she would line up so happily and proudly. But the church hasn't been to her front door in the last 7 years since she has become unable to move. And she has not tasted broken bread and shed blood for 7 years because no one even thinks about the commodity who needs just a little dose of communion. Tonight she cries. You say, oh, Tim, I'm getting depressed. Don't get depressed because we have good news, y'all.
Yes.
But before we ever hear good news, we've got to see the reality that Egypt is not just 3,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Egypt is right here, right now, in Alabama and Mississippi, in Tennessee and Florida, in Georgia and Kentucky, and Texas and Indiana, and Illinois, and I forget other places I've seen, but if I did name it, I'd mean yours too. Can you hear it? Talking about that millennial, 27-year-old guy who already is so in debt because everyone has said it's the coolest thing to live, I'll just name my city, in the it city of Nashville. And all it'll cost you is $4,000 a month for that 800 square foot apartment. Tonight, that 27-year-old single millennial, and by the way, I think we all know that among millennials, I find so intriguing. I don't even know what to make out of it. But the church is so concerned about people 40 years and younger. I wonder if the church knows that that's the largest population group in American history that has remained single. Single adults used to be 36% of the population. You begin now putting millennials in. And I know I'm getting really tired. I'm getting tired of millennial language just as much as you guys are. Tonight, that guy who's got that good-looking 800 square foot apartment downtown and can't pay the bill is even contemplating, I think the only way to get out of debt is just to end my life. Can you hear his cry? I could go on and on and on, but let's go back to Egypt. Moses knew the cries. He'd heard them. He saw the suffering. So much so that he said, I don't know how to handle this except, well, I don't have Facebook yet, so I can't just tell the world how evil Pharaoh is. I guess I'll just kill somebody. And he ends up in the wilderness. Are you ready for good news? Guess who always shows up in the Bible in the wilderness? You would almost think that his home was in the wilderness. In fact, the most ancient hymn we have, it's Habakkuk chapter 3, that talks about where God came from the beginning. I mean, it's a weird hymn. It doesn't really fit our modern day way of thinking. But the understanding was he came out of the wilderness. The wilderness and wilderness seasons are not the places where God does not show up. The wilderness is where God does show up. And so there's Moses is in the wilderness. How else do I describe this? He finds himself on holy ground. Now I got to real quick just say a word. That word, I don't know, Laura. I sang that song so much. I'm not going to sing the song yet. I sang that song so much. We are standing on holy ground. I don't take my shoes off because I know that's what Moses did. I'm getting to the point I want to say, whoa, stop the music. What's holy? What's holy ground? Whenever our ancestors would have heard that word holy, here's precisely what they would have thought. Because holy means, and I know we've given it so many sanctimonious, pious definitions. Every time that word in our Bibles, holy, is used, it means this. And I know this does not quite sound, I think I said it last night. It doesn't sound too holy, but that's what the word means. Different. Something's going to happen that's different. This is not just any ordinary God that's showing up. Something here is different. God shows up. Are you ready? In the middle of Egypt. In the middle of Egypt. In the middle of opioid crisis. And suicides. In the middle of mamas who get about 5 hours of sleep and work over 80 hours a week. In the middle of people who tonight are crying because of their slave drivers. You want to hear a different God? We track every God in other ancient religions.
Yes.
And those gods are the cause of the
Right.
cries.
Right.
Are you ready to hear what this God begins to say? Oh, Linda, this is good. I know you're a shouter and a screamer. You can stay there. Here's what he says. I've seen the misery of my people. Can I get one amen? No, here's why I want that amen. My friends, I don't know what over the course of 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years you bought into is the holiness of God. The holiness of God in the Bible is this. Gods don't hear human suffering and cries. This God does. This God tonight not only hears the cry of the Israelites in Egyptian slavery. This God hears the cry of that mama who's put in 80 hours this week. This God hears the cry of the opioid addicted. This God hears the cry of that middle-aged man who the only thing he knows is when he gets home, he's got to sneak away and find his computer and feed his addiction online. This God knows the cry, the pain, the suffering of that human being, not an object, not a commodity, but that human being who tonight feels like nothing more than a label. I have heard the cry of my people. Oh, it gets better. I've seen their sufferings. I'm not divorced from it. I'm not separate from it. I'm there. I've seen. I've heard. Oh, Keith, it gets better. I'm coming at you. One of the most beautiful words in all the Bible. And God says, I know their sufferings. Here's the reason I'm coming at you, Keith. Because for many of us, to know is to say, hi, my name's Tim. What's your name? Keith. Good to meet you, Keith. Oh, I know Keith. The word know, every time this word appears, it has this kind of meaning, and many times this is the exact context. And Adam knew Eve, and Eve conceived. So there you go. What that word means, and for God to say, I know their sufferings, it means this God is just not aware of what's happening to those Egyptians. This God isn't just aware of what's going on with that opioid addicted and that person who's got to run home to his computer and that mama who's working 80 hours a week and those who have been commodified and those who have been objectified. This God is intimately present there. I've seen, I've heard, I know. It gets better. This is not just the God who sees, hears, and knows. Now God says it this way. And I'm coming to Alabama to get them out of slavery. I've got to put a parenthesis. My friends, the Bible, neither Old nor New Testaments, ever gives you and me permission to spiritualize deliverance. Deliverance is not just, well, when you die and go to heaven, it'll all be okay. Deliverance is opioids meet their death.
Right.
Deliverance is mama's putting in 80 hours a week and getting about 5 hours of sleep. Somehow something begins to change and she has a life and she can hear the music and she joins the SoloCon once in a while. Deliverance. When did we take what God does in real life, flesh and blood lives and say, well, the important thing is that mama's got her life right with God? No, God is saying, I've heard her cry. And I have seen what she's going through. And I intimately know her suffering. And I'm coming down to rescue. Okay, I want you to do something because we're beginning to take the curve. And when you take the curve, that means the preacher's getting on a highway that's going to go to the end. So who is it tonight? Can we just get a face in our minds? That face may be somebody that you know. That face may be a whole community in your neighborhood. God says this. Oh, I think it's the four most beautiful lines, Linda. Outside of John 3:16, it's the four most beautiful lines in all the Bible. I've seen, I've heard, I know, and I'm coming. Well, that's so good. Can we say it together? Let's say it, okay? If you don't get it right, that's okay. Ready? I've seen, I've heard, I know, I'm coming. We're getting there. I give that about a B+, but I like A+. Let's do it again. I've seen, I've heard, I know, I'm coming. We're going to go one more time. I've seen, I've heard, I know, I'm coming. And you know what I want to do? I want to say to God, I'm moving out of the way. Come and do your thing. But there's one more line. It's my very, 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 very favorite line in all this story. Let me finish it out. Here we go. You ready? I've seen. Repeat it after I say it, okay? I've seen. I've heard. I know. I'm coming. You go. What? Did you see that story? I mean, it pumps you up and say, okay, Lord, you've seen, you've heard, you know, you're coming. SoloCon's going to get out of the way and let you do your thing in those people's lives. But my friends, remember we said this is holy. This is different. Every other God that we know of is a micromanager. Every other God plays chess with human beings. Every other God says, okay, you try, get out of my way now. I'll take care of it. Not this God. Keith, this God takes you seriously, man. When he called you, he didn't call you and say, and Keith, if you can't do it, don't worry, buddy. I'm God. I'll just step in there. You say, Tim, that's my kind of God. Well, then go worship Zeus, but don't worship the God of Scripture. Can I get an amen? We have led for the last century, we have let pop Christianity in North America steal the God of the Bible.
Yeah.
So that for many a Christian, many a well-meaning Christian, sovereignty is the manipulative acts of God.
Right.
Sovereignty is not the manipulative acts of God. You know real sovereignty? Sovereignty is this. I've seen. I've heard. I know. I'm coming. You go. You go. Bill, you go. Carol and Jerry, you go. Linda, you go. Come on, let's go. Lord, I think I'm just going to stay at SoloCon and think about how things used to be.
Uh-oh.
I've heard the greatest question multiple times this weekend. Where do we go now? I've seen, I've heard, I know, I'm coming. I wanted to dance with you so long. You don't even respond. You go. And I start to hyperventilate. I want you to think about it, y'all. You know why it is, seriously, you know why it is that we want a sovereign God who finally says, move aside, nice try, I'll do it. Because if we have that kind of God, then we don't really have to take some responsibility. And God doesn't dance solo. God always calls another dance partner onto the stage with God. God, who am I? Did you see my score on the Enneagram? Have you seen my personality test? But God, did you hear what they told me? God, who am I? And I love God's answer. But look at your background. Look at your personality. Look at, you are just fit for this. Okay, now, some of you ought to be saying, whatever the opposite of amen is. Do you, no man. Do you hear God's answer? When I first read this many years ago, I thought, well, that's kind of smart aleck. Although, you know, God's not smart aleck, so I won't call it that. So let me go back to it. Who am I? I'm with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the only answer Moses gives.
Yes.
But who are you? What's your name? Tell me about yourself. We're not going to go into a long thing. I'm just going to do this in about 45 seconds. God says it this way. Okay, I haven't done speaking unknown languages on you, okay? He says, hey, yeah, sure, hey. And what that means is I will be whoever I will be.
Yeah.
And if you read the rest of the story, this is where that I will be keeps happening. You go to Pharaoh, I'll be with you. You go to the people, I'll be with you. You come back to this mountain, I'll be with you. Y'all, I wish I could spend a few more minutes, but I won't. I promise you. Everybody said amen. How holy that is, how different that is. Every other god, from Zeus to Baal, from Marduk to Chemosh, every other god resides in a mountain. They stay back at Sinai. They stay back, and when you want to worship them, you go to them. Not this God. This God says, you go, I'll be with you. Wherever you go.
Thank you, Lord.
Who am I? I'm with you. But who are you? I'm with you. But God, what if? Well, I mean, whoever. Moses was Tim. Tim is Moses. Because once God's given me back his "I'm with you" thing, then my next thing is, well, what if? What if I go to Pharaoh? What if I go to the people? What if? I'm going to say it again, and I'm being very facetious. It'd just be so much easier just to stay here in SoloCon until we die. We just have a little graveyard out here. Never have to worry about the world. But here's the problem. God's leaving Sumatonga. God's coming off of Mount Sinai. And so in the midst of all my what ifs, don't you love the two object lessons God gives? What's in your hand? Throw it down. But it's that everyday staff that becomes more than Moses could have ever asked or imagined. When his ordinary staff and an extraordinary God become dance partners. And I find it interesting, the other object lesson is all again about his hand. That hand's going to be pretty important in Moses' life. Moses, stick it in there. Whoa, it's leprous. Moses put it back in. Whoa, it's clean again. But you've got to give me your ordinary hand, just like you've got to give me your ordinary staff. And together we are going to do a dance. And when we do a dance, your ordinary hand, your ordinary staff, and my divine presence with you will do more through your staff and through your hand than you could ever ask or imagine. And then I love this one. Those of you that are tracking, we are pulling into the parking lot. Okay. I figured it out. If I ask God a question, he's just going to throw me back an answer. Who am I? Who are you? But what if? The answer to that is don't ask God a question. Just tell him. And that's what Moses finally does. Yeah. I can't do it. I can't speak. I don't know. Some people want to think that he stuttered. Other people want to think that he just wasn't eloquent. Now, I know where I have usually preached this is, so if you can't speak, God is going to give you an Aaron. But you know what I find so intriguing? Like this, actually, I just saw this a couple years ago. God said, okay, I'll give you Aaron. And here's the line, and it's the repeated line. Every other time Moses has objected. Who am I? I'm with you. Who are you? I'm with you. But what if? I'm with you. I can't. You can't do what? Oh, it's something about your mouth. This is the greatest line. I missed it. I am with, go read that tonight. Your mouth. The very thing that causes me to say, I can't. But God, I'm at a part of my journey of life, I can't. But God, where I live, I can't. But God, in the community where I live, I can't. But God, I used to be able to, but I can't. I love this leader. Because it follows exactly what God's been telling him all along. The very thing that causes you to say, I can't, I will be with your mouth. You know what I love? This is the other thing that never dawned. I mean, I have preached. Oh, God gives you God, everything you're talking. Y'all, have you ever read the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? If anybody in all the Bible has the gift of gab, it's Moses. Those books are basically nothing but works of Moses. Maybe you will need an Aaron. But I would promise you, the very thing that causes Tim to say, I can't, because when God says, then I'll be with your I can't. Just look and see. He will do immeasurably more than you could ever ask or imagine. Oh, y'all, I've got the greatest news in all the world, and it goes like this. I've seen, I've heard, I know, I'm coming. I want you now to think of your community, okay? Think of your community. And your community is not Sumatonga right now. Think of your neighborhood. Think of those who tonight are no more than commodities, no more than objects. I want you to say the words of God now, okay? Think of them. In fact, if you can get one image in your mind, just get it. If you have to close your eyes, just talk to them, okay? You ready to say the words of God to them? I've seen, I've heard, I know, I'm coming. Come on now. God is talking to that community. Say it with me again. I've seen, I've heard, I know, I'm coming. You ready? You go. And I am with you. And I'm with your mouth. And I'm with your common ordinary hand. Uh-oh. I don't think I was speaking to my community on behalf of God. I think I'm now speaking to my community. If God says you go, I've seen, I've heard, I know, I'm coming. Y'all with me? God says it. But Linda, it makes me want to dance. Now, you know what it makes me want to do? It makes me want to receive God's, I've seen, I've heard, I know, I'm coming. Oh, Tim, I've seen, I know, I've heard, I'm coming. But all of a sudden, the dance can be complete as I now, by God's grace, extend my arms and I speak with God to my world. And it's not just God coming, but it's God's dance partner coming. I want you now to say those words, not just on behalf of God, but I want you to say those words, speaking it into your community and asking, what then does it look like for me to see, for me to hear, for me to know, and for me to come? You ready to say it? I've seen, I've heard, I know, I'm coming. And lo, Linda, oh, Linda, I am with you always. And so I was doing my 3 count. Come on, Timothy. 1, 2. I was ready. And right when I got to 3, I'm coming at you. I felt the most familiar, calloused hand. And it embraced me. And all he said was, Timmy, let's go. And I said one word, Daddy? You want to stay with me? It's going to look okay. It's better this way. I did. He did it this way. And you know what's amazing, Linda? We didn't run down the aisle. Nobody turned the lights on. In my 5-year-old imagination, every green monster was still behind every pew. But Linda's amazing. I breathed so easy. We just kind of moseyed down the aisle. Because I knew that the one who called me, isn't this fun? I knew that the one who called me would never call me without walking down the aisle with me. And I was going down the aisle. I think he even did it this way. Tonight, friends, I don't know where you are in the journey. I honestly don't know. Now what? After the most amazing reunion. I do know this. God's calling. And God has seen, and God has heard, and God knows, and God is coming. And God is saying, now you go. But the God who calls you, I just don't want to let you go. The God who calls you, the God who calls us. Can I say this way? Until the day you take your last breath, there is no retirement for God's children. There's no being put on the shelf for God's children. There's no, wow, I had a good 40 years of doing that ministry. Now I'll watch those millennials do it. There's no hanging it up. God calls. We go. I'm going to walk you back to your seat. Just because this is nice. Tonight, where do we go? I know one place we go is we say, here I am. And I'll stay on holy ground as long as you speak. And I just believe tonight, there's probably some of us. No, I will take it back. I believe all of us are simply responding to Him. Speak. Speak. The song we sang kind of speaks on behalf of those who God says, I've seen, I've heard, I know, I'm coming. And so I want to invite us to sing that song on behalf. I know we want bad to sing it from our hearts, but I want to invite you to sing it on their behalf. And at any point that you wish to stand, turn around and kneel, raise a hand or two, or if you have 3 or 4, kneel at an altar. At any point, your heart says, my body's got to respond some way. I just want to invite you to do that. Can we? Let's join together.
believe in the sun. I believe in the risen one. I believe I've overcome by the power of His blood. Amen. Amen. Our God, our Spirit. Amen. Amen.
Let my song join the never end.
Because
Sing it on their behalf. Not your behalf, their behalf. Amen.
I will stand in the rain. I was covered in sin and shame. I heard mercy call my name. He rolled the sky away. Let my soul join the water because of this. I will face tomorrow because He lives. Everything is right. I know He holds my life. My future is bright. Amen. Amen. I'm alive because He lives. Amen. Amen. Let my soul join the light that never ends. I'm alive because He lives. Let my soul join the one that never ends. Because He lives. Because He lives. Amen. Amen. I'm alive because He lives. Amen. Amen. Let my soul join the one that never ends because He lives.
Laura, there's that kind of old Gaither song that Dave you moved into. In just a moment, I want us to sing that old song on behalf of the opioid addicted, the single mama who's given everything she's got just to keep her babies fed. The widow that the church has forgotten she still has an appetite for communion, even if she can't come into the walls of the church. The young adult man tonight is so in debt, he doesn't know what to do with his life. And you know others to add to that list, don't you? I want us now to sing for them. I know this is our testimony. My friends, this is the hope for their testimony. Are you ready? Let's sing for them. Because He lives, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, all fear is gone. Because I know He holds the future, and life is worth the living just because He lives. And God says tonight, and we say tonight, these words. Would you say them with me if you can remember? I've seen, I've heard, I know, I'm coming. You go, and lo, I am with you always. And my friends, may by God's grace, wow, a blessing to go dance. By God's grace, may you hear the music. May you catch the beat. May you live not by tips, but by grace. And as you do the dance, receive His grace. Embrace His grace. Release His grace. And the God of all grace, who calls you to this, is faithful. And He will dance with you. And all God's people said, amen, amen. Would you turn to someone and just extend grace some way to them? Amen.
Put it on camera in my state, and particularly me, we have that in, you know, but I'm not gonna say it now. Get that budget back to course. In my state, cut that off, you know, and say,
Well, hopefully, there's stuff going on. They got 'em.